Imagine a child being torn from her home by the very hands that should protect her most. She screams, cries, clings to the door, but her parents' eyes don't blink. No explanation, no goodbye, just the cutting silence of a decision that would change everything. The entire village watched and stayed silent. What happened in that moment was legal, but will never be forgivable. Years later, that same child returns, but she's no longer a child. She carries in her eyes a strength built between cold walls, silenced voices and buried secrets. She's come to see with her own eyes what remains of those who forgot her, and what she holds in her hands will change everything. Because before crossing that door, she left a hidden note, and to this day nobody knows who found it. In a coastal village forgotten by time called Kilgariff, where the Atlantic winds carried the salt of centuries and the smell of turf fires mixed with sea spray, the morning chorus of seabirds was interrupted by an unusual sound on that Wednesday morning. The tires of a white van pulling up outside the Tierney house. The vehicle looked official, clinical, with government plates and tinted windows that reflected nothing but the gray sky above. Inside the house of cold stone and small windows where generations of Tierneys had lived and died, a 13-year-old girl named Ailbe clutched the wooden doorframe with white knuckles, her fingernails digging into the paint that her grandfather had applied decades before. She screamed desperately, her voice cracking with terror. "Duh, please, don't do this to me. I'm your daughter. I'm your blood." The words echoed through the small cottage, bouncing off walls that had witnessed countless family meals, birthday celebrations, and bedtime stories. But Ian Tierney didn't respond. He simply watched with the eyes of someone who had already departed from within long ago. His weathered face set like granite against the Atlantic storms. His calloused hands, which had once braided her red hair and taught her to skip stones on the beach, now hung uselessly at his sides. Beside him, Siobhan, her mother, remained motionless as a statue, holding a small brown suitcase packed with Ailbe's few belongings and wearing an empty expression, as if she were no longer part of this world but merely a ghost haunting her own life. The neighbors had gathered in their doorways pretending to tend their gardens or check their post, but their eyes were fixed on the terrible scene unfolding. Mrs. O'Sullivan from next door crossed herself and whispered a prayer, whilst old Paddy Flanagan spat into the dirt and turned away, unable to watch. Children pressed their faces against windows, sensing something momentous and awful was happening but not understanding what. Two men in crisp blue uniforms stepped down from the vehicle with practiced efficiency. They moved like undertakers, solemn and methodical in their duty. Without saying a word, they walked to Ailbe, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones. The taller one, with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed apologetic, reached for her gently at first. "Come along now, love. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But Ailbe fought like a wildcat, scratching and kicking, her school dress tearing as she struggled. "I won't go. You can't make me. Ma, tell them I'm good. Tell them I'm sorry for whatever I did." Her voice broke on the last words, a child's desperate plea for mercy that would never come. The men pulled her by the arms with professional restraint, neither cruel nor gentle, simply efficient. As they forced her into the van, she pressed her face against the small rear window, her breath fogging the glass as she pleaded for something that wouldn't come, a gesture of regret, a wave. Any trace of the love she'd once believed was unconditional. Her parents simply remained there on their doorstep, motionless as scarecrows, watching their daughter disappear from their lives. Ailbe screamed until her throat was raw, scratched at the reinforced glass until her fingernails bled, but there was no turning back. The van's engine hummed with mechanical indifference as it carried her away from everything she'd ever known. What her parents did in that instant in the eyes of the law and the church was perfectly legal. They had signed the papers, paid the fees, made their decision, but in the eyes of the soul, in the realm where love and betrayal waged their eternal war, it was utterly, completely, eternally unforgivable. In the distance, perched on the hill overlooking the village like a black crow against the gray sky, Father Domhnall Gorey observed everything through the rectory window. His arthritic fingers gripped his rosary beads with trembling intensity, the worn wooden crucifix cutting into his palm. He knew exactly where that van was taking young Ailbe Tierney, and more than that, he knew precisely what happened in that godforsaken place. The letters had crossed his desk, the checks had been signed, the arrangements had been made with his blessing. But when the moment came to witness the consequence of his complicity, he preferred to keep his eyes on the sky, muttering prayers that felt like ash in his mouth. And then, for the first time in 37 years of faithful service, the bell of Kilgariff Church didn't ring that morning. The silence stretched across the village like a shroud. And in that silence, the greatest secret of that forgotten place began to take root. As the white van disappeared around the bend in the coastal road, carrying its cargo of broken childhood towards an uncertain fate, the people of Kilgariff went about their daily business. But something had changed in the salt air that morning. Something that would linger long after the sound of the engine had faded. In that silence began the greatest secret of that village. Ailbe woke to the sound of heavy doors slamming shut, and the acrid smell of industrial bleach burning her nostrils like acid. The chemical stench was so overwhelming that she gagged, her empty stomach contracting painfully as she tried to orient herself in the unfamiliar darkness. She lay on a narrow iron bed with a thin, stained mattress that smelled of disinfectant and the fierce sweat of countless girls who had occupied it before her. The room was a perfect square of white painted concrete, empty except for the bed and a small wooden table. High on the wall, a camera stared down at her with its unblinking mechanical eye, recording every movement, every expression of despair that crossed her face. Beside the bed lay a folded uniform and a notebook with a faded blue cover bearing the words, Carrickley Institute for Wayward Girls, Character and Moral Reform Unit, property of the state. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, trembling from either the exhaustion of the journey or the terror that had settled into her bones like winter cold. Through the small barred window, she could see nothing but gray sky and the tops of pine trees that swayed in the Atlantic wind like mourners at a graveside. The glass was reinforced with wire mesh, making escape impossible and hope seem foolish. In the corridor beyond her door, she could hear muffled voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones, and occasionally the sound of girls crying, not the dramatic sobs of children seeking attention, but the quiet, hopeless weeping of souls being slowly crushed. And amongst these sounds, cutting through them like a blade, came a sharp crack that made her blood freeze, the unmistakable sound of leather striking flesh. The uniform they'd left for her was made of coarse brown wool, scratchy and uncomfortable against her skin. The fabric was rough and cheap, designed not for comfort, but for humiliation. A constant reminder that she was no longer a person with individual identity but merely another number in the system. The high collar felt like a noose around her throat, and when she finally forced herself to put it on, she felt as though she was burying the last remnant of who she'd been in her previous life. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. No one came to explain where she was or what was expected of her. The silence was broken only by the institutional sounds of the building, footsteps echoing in corridors, keys jangling, doors opening and closing with metallic finality. Sometimes she heard what sounded like prayers being recited in unison, voices raised in mechanical devotion that somehow sounded more frightening than screams. That evening, as darkness began to fall outside her window, a subtle knock on the wall caught her attention. 3 deliberate taps, followed by a pause, then 2 more taps. The pattern was clearly intentional, a code of some kind. Her heart racing with the first hope she'd felt since arriving, she responded instinctively, mimicking the rhythm against the cold concrete. The reply came in a whisper so soft she had to press her ear against the wall to hear it. "Are you new?" The voice belonged to a girl with a lilting northern accent, someone who sounded slightly older than herself. "My name's Kawimhe. I'm in the room beside yours." "I'm Ailbe," she whispered back, her voice cracking with emotion at this first human contact. "I don't understand what's happening. Why am I here?" There was a long pause before Kawimi responded, and when she did, her voice carried a weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Try not to ask questions. Here, asking hurts. They don't like curiosity. They don't like thinking. Just do what they say when they say it. And maybe you'll survive." Before Ailbe could ask what she meant by survive, the door to her room burst open with a crash that made her jump away from the wall. A woman in a severe black habit stood silhouetted in the doorway, her face hidden in shadow but her presence radiating cold authority. She wore a dark woolen coat over her religious garments and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Time for evening doctrine," the woman announced in a voice like winter wind through bare branches. She pointed a long, bony finger at Ailbe. "Come, now. Don't dawdle." Ailbe was led through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past doors marked with numbers but no names, past windows that showed only darkness beyond. The nun's heels clicked against the stone floor with military precision, keeping time like a funeral march. Other girls occasionally appeared in doorways, watching with hollow eyes before quickly retreating into their rooms like frightened rabbits. The doctrine room was a large space with wooden benches arranged in rows facing a simple wooden cross mounted on the white wall. Perhaps 20 girls sat with their heads bowed, all wearing identical brown uniforms, all appearing to be between the ages of 12 and 17. Their faces were blank, expressionless, as if their personalities had been systematically erased. Sister Margaret, the head matron, stood before them like a judge pronouncing sentence. Her voice was honeyed poison as she led them in recitation. All disobedience is an offense to God. The holy woman is she who remains silent, dresses modestly with perfect propriety, and honors her Father's name above all earthly concerns. Rebellion is the devil's tool. Submission is the path to salvation. The other girls repeated the words in perfect unison, their voices flat and mechanical, but Ailbe didn't recite. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat like stones. Instead, she simply stared at Sister Margaret with eyes blazing with the kind of rage that comes from betrayal, so complete it scorches the soul. The nun's cold gray eyes met hers across the room, and in that moment, Ailbe saw something that chilled her more than the building's stone walls. Satisfaction. Sister Margaret smiled, a thin, cruel expression that never reached her eyes. "We have a new arrival," she announced to the room, "one who hasn't yet learned the value of humility." And in that gaze, in that moment of silent confrontation between the child who refused to break and the woman whose life's work was breaking children, something sparked and caught fire. The seed of resistance had been planted in soil, watered with tears and fertilized with righteous anger. But resisting there, Ailbe was beginning to understand, was the same as dying slowly. In the second week of her imprisonment at Carrickley, Ailbe began to notice disturbing patterns in the rigid routine of institutional life. The morning bell rang at 5:30 sharp, followed by mandatory prayers in the chapel where girls knelt on cold stone floors until their knees bled through their stockings. Breakfast consisted of thin porridge and stale bread served in metal bowls that bore the scratches and dents of countless desperate fingers. But most troubling of all was the realization that Kawim, the girl whose whispered voice had been her only comfort in those first terrifying nights, no longer appeared in the dining hall. Ailbe searched the sea of identical brown uniforms during every meal, looking for the girl with the gentle northern accent who had warned her about asking questions. But Kawim's usual spot at the third table from the window remained empty day after day. When Ailbe dared to ask one of the other girls where she'd gone, the response was always the same. A quick shake of the head, frightened eyes darting toward the supervising nuns, and a barely audible whisper, "Don't ask about the missing ones." The staff, when pressed with carefully worded inquiries, offered only vague institutional speak. "She's been reallocated to a more suitable facility," Sister Margaret would say with that cold smile that never reached her eyes. "Some girls require different approaches to their rehabilitation, but the other girls, those hollow-eyed survivors who had learned to navigate this maze of cruelty and control, simply lowered their gazes and ate their meager portions in silence." Each night, Ailbe pressed her ear against the wall that separated her room from Sawima's, tapping out the same pattern they'd established. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, but night after night, only silence answered her calls. The concrete was cold against her cheek as she waited, hoping, praying for some sign that her friend was still there, still breathing, still fighting in whatever small way she could manage. On the 10th night of silence, desperation drove Ailbe to take risks she'd never have considered in her previous life. During the supervised cleaning period, when the girls were assigned to scrub floors and dust furniture under the watchful eyes of the matrons, she managed to slip away from her designated area. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept down the corridor toward Koimi's room, each footstep echoing like thunder in her ears. The door was unlocked, unusual for Carrickley, where every room was secured after lights out. Ailbe pushed it open with trembling fingers and stepped into what should have been an identical cell to her own. But this room was different. It was completely empty, not just of personal belongings, but of any sign that a human being had ever occupied it. The mattress had been removed from the iron bed frame, leaving only rusted springs. The small wooden table was gone. Even the regulation blanket had been taken away. But it was what she found during her frantic search that made her blood run cold. Wedged behind the radiator, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a small piece of paper. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing words scratched into the surface with what looked like a fingernail or perhaps a piece of broken glass. "Don't forget who you are. or they'll rewrite you completely. Fight in the silence. C. The message hit her like a physical blow. Someone had struggled before her. Someone had tried to resist the systematic erasure of identity that was Charicle's true purpose, and someone had failed. Kawimi's room wasn't just empty, it was erased, as if she had never existed at all. The institutional efficiency of it was terrifying in its completeness. Ailba stuffed the note into her shoe and hurried back to her cleaning duties, her mind reeling with implications. If girls could simply disappear without trace, if their very existence could be wiped clean like chalk from a blackboard, then what chance did any of them have? The other girls' silence suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't just afraid of punishment. They were afraid of erasure. That evening, during the mandatory prayer session, Ailbe found herself studying the faces around her with new eyes. How many girls had simply vanished from these benches? How many empty spaces had been filled by new arrivals? The cycle continuing endlessly. The prayers felt like funeral rites for the living. Last words spoken over souls being buried while their bodies still drew breath. Later, alone in her cell, Ailbe made a decision that would define the rest of her time at Charicly. She would not be erased. She would not disappear into the institutional void that had swallowed Kawimi. And God knows how many others. If they wanted to rewrite her, they would have to fight for every word. Using a small piece of metal she'd prized from her bed frame, she began her own message, scratching letters into the concrete behind her pillow where the cameras couldn't see. It was slow, painful work that left her fingers bloody, but each mark felt like an act of rebellion. Ailbe Tierney was here. Ailbe Tierney existed. Ailbe Tierney will not be forgotten. The next morning brought a new development that would test her resolve. During inspection, when the girls stood beside their beds while matrons searched their possessions for contraband, Sister Margaret's cold eyes seemed to linger on Ailbe longer than usual. Some of our residents, she announced to the room, seem to believe they can wander freely through our facility. This is a dangerous misconception. Fear crawled up Ailbe's spine like ice water. Had someone seen her in Kawimi's room? Were there cameras she hadn't noticed? The matron's next words confirmed her worst fears. Curiosity is not a virtue here, girls. It's a weakness that leads to unpleasant consequences. That night, as Ailbe lay on her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was faint, barely audible through the thick walls, but unmistakable. A voice she recognized crying out in what sounded like pain or terror. It was coming from somewhere deep within the building, from a part of Charicly that wasn't marked on any of the maps posted in the corridors. The voice was Kawimi's. Ailbe pressed her face against the cold window, trying to determine the direction of the sound. It seemed to be coming from below, from some basement level she'd never known existed. The realization hit her like a hammer blow. Kawimi hadn't been reallocated to another facility. She was still here, somewhere in the depths of this cursed place, experiencing something too terrible to imagine. As she lay there in the darkness, listening to the distant echoes of her friend's suffering, Ailbe understood that she was facing a choice that would define not just her time at Charicly, but the rest of her life. She could follow the example of the other girls, keep her head down, recite the prayers, submit to the system, and hope to survive until release. Or she could fight, knowing that fighting might mean joining Kawimi in whatever hell existed beneath their feet. The piece of metal she'd hidden felt sharp against her palm as she gripped it like a lifeline. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin mapping the building's secrets. She would find out what had happened to Kawimi, and to all the other girls who had simply vanished from the dining hall benches. And what she saw there would change everything she believed about the place. 2 months had crawled by in the gray purgatory of Charicly, each day bleeding into the next like watercolors in rain. Ailbe had stopped counting the sunrise bells that called them to prayer, the spoonfuls of watery porridge that constituted breakfast, the hours spent scrubbing floors until her knees were raw and bleeding. Time had become meaningless in this place where seasons were marked not by weather, but by which girls disappeared, and which new faces appeared to fill their empty spaces. She had grown thinner, her school uniform hanging loose on her diminishing frame. Her red hair, once her pride, had been cropped short in the regulation style that Sister Margaret claimed promoted spiritual focus and reduced vanity. The harsh soap they were given had left her skin dry and cracked, her hands bearing the permanent stains of bleach and floor polish. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening inside her mind. She found herself speaking less, moving more quietly through the corridors, flinching at sudden sounds. The other girls had warned her about this. how the place got into your blood, how it changed the way you breathed, the way you held your shoulders, the way you looked at the world. It's the breaking, an older girl named Mare had whispered during laundry duty. First, your body learns to hurt quietly, then your mind learns to be small. On a gray Tuesday morning that felt no different from any other, a guard appeared at Ailbe's cell door during the morning inspection. "Tierney," she barked, consulting a clipboard with the efficiency of someone who had delivered this message countless times before. "You have a visitor." The words hit Ailbe like electricity. A visitor? Her heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. Could it be? Had her parents finally come to their senses? Had they realized what they'd done and come to take her home? The possibility filled her with a desperate hope that was almost painful in its intensity. She was led through corridors she'd never seen before, past offices with closed doors and windows that looked out onto what appeared to be normal countryside. The world beyond Carrickley still existed, a fact she'd almost forgotten during her imprisonment. Trees still grew, clouds still moved across the sky, and somewhere out there people were living ordinary lives, eating meals around kitchen tables, tucking children into warm beds, doing all the things that now seemed as distant as fairy tales. The visiting room was a stark space divided by thick glass panels, with metal stools bolted to the floor and telephones that crackled with static. Ailbe was directed to booth number 3, and when she looked through the reinforced glass, her heart nearly stopped beating entirely. It wasn't her parents. It was Aunt Ariane. Ariane Coughlin sat on the other side of the glass barrier, and she was already crying before Ailbe had even picked up the phone. Her aunt looked older than she remembered, with new lines around her eyes and gray streaks in her honey-colored hair that hadn't been there just months before. She wore her good coat, the navy wool one she usually reserved for funerals and important occasions, and clutched a worn leather handbag in her lap like a lifeline. With trembling hands, Ailbe lifted the phone receiver. Ariane's voice came through the crackling line, thick with tears and barely controlled emotion. "Oh, my darling girl. Oh, Ailbe. What have they done to you?" "Auntie Ariane," Ailbe whispered, her own tears starting to flow for the first time since her arrival at Carrickley. The sound of a familiar voice, someone who knew her real name and remembered who she used to be, broke something inside her that she'd been carefully holding together. "I've tried to be good. I've tried so hard to be what they want, but it's never enough." Ariane pressed her palm against the glass, and Ailbe matched the gesture from her side, their hands separated by inches in institutional policy. "I've tried everything," her aunt said, her voice breaking. "I went to the courthouse, to the bishop's office, to the local council. I wrote letters to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. I even went to your parents' house and begged them to reconsider." "And?" Ailbe asked, though she already knew the answer from the defeat in her aunt's eyes. "They have legal guardianship over you, love. The papers were signed, the fees were paid, and the church supports their decision. I'm not immediate family in the eyes of the law. I can't override their authority." Ariane's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Ailbe. I'm so bloody sorry I can't get you out of here." The phone receiver felt heavy in Ailbe's hand as the reality settled over her like a shroud. No rescue was coming. No dramatic intervention would save her from this place. She was trapped here until she turned 18, or until she broke completely, whichever came first. "Do they?" Ailbe's voice caught in her throat. "Do they ever ask about me? Do they ever wonder if I'm all right?" Ariane's silence stretched for so long that Ailbe thought the phone line had gone dead. When her aunt finally spoke, her words carried the weight of truth that cuts deeper than any lie. "Your mother won't speak about you at all. And your father, he drinks now, more than before. The neighbors say he sits in his chair by the window sometimes, staring at the road like he's waiting for something that's never going to come." "Tell me they remember me," Ailbe pleaded, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. "Tell me I wasn't just erased from their lives like I never existed." "You exist," Ariane said fiercely, her tears flowing freely now. "You exist in my heart, in my prayers, in every moment of every day. I carry you with me, Ailbe. Your laugh, your stubborn streak, the way you used to climb the apple tree in my garden and refuse to come down until I promised you extra biscuits with your tea." The visit could only last 30 minutes. Another institutional rule designed to limit connection and hope. As their time drew to a close, Ariane leaned forward urgently. "Listen to me carefully, love. I know this place is trying to change you, to make you into something you're not, but you must remember who you are. Remember the girl who used to catch butterflies in jam jars and then set them free because she couldn't bear to see them trapped? Remember the child who stood up to Tommy McGrath when he was bullying smaller kids, even though he was twice your size? I'm trying, Ailby whispered, but it's so hard. They make you feel like you deserve this, like you brought it on yourself. You didn't deserve this, Ariane said with quiet intensity. No child deserves this. What's happening to you is wrong and cruel, and someday the world will know it. But until then, you must survive, not just in body, but in spirit. Don't let them take that fire inside you, that spark that makes you who you are. The guard appeared behind Ailba, indicating that visiting time was over. As she stood to leave, Ariane pressed something against the glass, a small photograph. It showed the two of them from the previous summer, standing in Ariane's garden with their arms around each other, both laughing at something now forgotten. Ailby memorized every detail: the sunshine in her hair, the genuine happiness in both their faces, the way she looked when she was loved unconditionally. I'll never stop fighting for you, Ariane called out as the guards led Ailby away. Never stop hoping. Never stop believing that you'll come home to me someday. Back in her cell that night, Ailby sat on her narrow bed and stared at the place on the wall where she'd scratched her name. The visit had given her something precious, the knowledge that she hadn't been completely forgotten, that somewhere in the world, someone still saw her as a person worth saving, rather than a problem to be solved. She pulled out the piece of metal she'd been using to carve messages and began a new inscription beside her name. Ariane loves me. Someone remembers who I used to be. The words cut deep into the concrete, permanent marks that no amount of institutional whitewash could completely erase. But even as she carved these small acts of rebellion, a cold dread was settling in her stomach, because tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to break her spirit, and she was beginning to understand that survival here required more than just hope. On the door, two men in dark suits appeared with an envelope bearing her name written in careful handwriting. In the weeks that followed Aunt Ariane's devastating visit, something fundamental shifted inside Ailby's heart. The knowledge that she was legally trapped, that no rescue would come, that her parents had chosen to abandon her completely, should have broken her spirit entirely. Instead, it ignited something fierce and desperate, a need to reach across the void they had created and force them to acknowledge what they had done. Every night after lights out, when the corridors fell into their uneasy quiet and the only sounds were the distant crying of broken girls and the mechanical hum of institutional life, Ailby began to write. Using paper torn from the margins of her prayer book and pencil stubs she'd managed to smuggle from the weekly educational sessions, she poured her heart onto scraps that she kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard she'd discovered under her bed. The first letter was to her father, and the words came out in a torrent of pain and confusion that left her hands shaking. "Duh, I don't understand what I did wrong. I keep trying to remember the last conversation we had. The last time you looked at me like I was your daughter instead of a stranger. Was it because I argued with Ma about going to Mass every day? Was it because I asked too many questions about why women couldn't be priests? I'm trying so hard to be good here, Da. They make us pray for hours until our knees bleed on the stone floor. They make us scrub toilets with our bare hands and call it character building. Is this what you wanted for me? Is this the daughter you were trying to create?" The second letter was to her mother, and it carried a different kind of anguish. The bewilderment of a daughter who couldn't understand how the woman who had sung her lullabies could now sleep peacefully knowing where those lullabies had led. "Ma, do you remember teaching me to braid my hair? You used to say I had the most beautiful red curls, like autumn leaves touched by fire. They cut it all off here, Ma. They said vanity was a sin and that girls like me needed to learn humility. Do you know what they mean by girls like me? Girls who ask questions, girls who think, girls whose spirits haven't been properly crushed yet. Is that what I was to you? A spirit that needed crushing?" Night after night, she wrote with increasing desperation, each letter an attempt to reach across the chasm of their abandonment and touch whatever humanity might remain in the people who had once been her parents. Some letters were angry, filled with the righteous fury of a child betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. Others were pleading, the desperate words of a daughter still hoping for love that would never come. She wrote about the daily humiliations of Carrickley life, the cold showers that lasted exactly 2 minutes, the meals of thin gruel and stale bread that left them all constantly hungry, the moral instruction sessions where they were forced to recite confessions of sins they'd never committed. She wrote about the girls who'd simply vanished in the night, about the screams that echoed from the basement levels, about the way hope died a little more each day in this place designed to kill it. The letters accumulated under her floorboard like evidence of a crime, each one a testament to the systematic destruction of a child's faith in the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. When she finally had enough saved pocket money from the meager allowance they were given for good behavior, she began the heartbreaking process of sending them. The first letter went out on a Tuesday, carried by the weekly mail collection that was one of their few connections to the outside world. Ailbe watched through her barred window as the postal van drove away, carrying with it her desperate words and fragile hope. She had addressed it carefully in her best handwriting. Mr. Ian Tierney, Seaview Cottage, Kilgariff Village, County Cork. Days passed in an agony of anticipation. Would he read it? Would it reach whatever remained of his paternal heart? Would her words break through the wall of silence and denial they had built around their decision? She found herself watching for the return post with an intensity that made her chest ache, scanning the faces of the girls who received the rare letters from family members who still cared enough to write. A week later, her answer came. The envelope arrived with her own handwriting still visible on the front, but now it bore an additional stamp that made her blood run cold. Return to sender. Recipient refuses delivery. The words hit her like a physical blow. They wouldn't even open it. They wouldn't even read her desperate plea for understanding, for connection, for some acknowledgement that she had once been their daughter. The finality of that rejection was more devastating than any punishment Carrickley could devise. But Ailbe was her father's daughter in ways he had never intended. She had inherited his stubborn streak, his refusal to give up even when the odds were impossible. She wrote another letter, and another, each one a different approach to the same desperate goal. Some were formal and polite, the kind of correspondence a well-behaved daughter might send from boarding school. Others were raw emotional appeals that laid her heart bare on the page. All of them came back with the same cruel stamp. Recipient refuses delivery. After the fifth returned letter, something inside Ailbe finally snapped. She gathered all the rejected correspondence. Weeks of her heart poured onto paper, all of it unwanted, unread, unloved, and carried them to the small courtyard behind the dormitory building. This was the one spot where the security cameras had a blind angle, where she could act without being observed and punished. One by one, she set fire to the letters using matches she'd stolen from the kitchen during her work detail. She watched her words turn to ash and smoke, each burning page releasing the pain and hope she'd invested in it. The flames seemed to consume not just the paper, but something vital inside her, the last remnants of the little girl who had believed that love was unconditional, that parents were supposed to protect their children, that family meant something more than biology and legal obligation. As she stood there watching her desperate communications burn, she felt someone approach from behind. It was Sorcha, a new arrival who still carried the bewildered look of fresh trauma. Her eyes still bright with the kind of hope that Carrickley specialized in extinguishing. She was perhaps 14, with the pale complexion and dark hair common to girls from the western counties, and she moved with the careful hesitation of someone trying not to attract attention. "What are you burning?" Sorcha asked in a whisper, glancing nervously at the dormitory windows to make sure they weren't being watched. "Letters to people who don't want to hear from me," Ailbe replied, her voice hollow. "Words that don't matter to anyone but me." Sorcha was quiet for a moment, watching the flames consume the last of the correspondence. Then she said something that surprised Ailbe with its wisdom. "Maybe they matter because they're yours. Maybe burning them doesn't make them disappear. Maybe it just sets them free." In that moment, looking at this new girl who still possessed the spark that Carrickley was designed to extinguish, Ailbe felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the desire to protect someone else. She reached out and took Sorcha's hand, feeling how cold and small it was, like a bird that had fallen from its nest. "Listen to me," Ailbe said urgently, pulling Sorcha closer to the dying flames. "Don't listen to what they tell you here. Don't believe them when they say you're broken or sinful or need to be fixed. You're not bad, Sorcha. You were just born with a light inside you that some people want to put out because it makes them uncomfortable." Sorcha smiled then, the first genuine smile Ailbe had seen from anyone at Carrickley in months. It was like watching sunrise after an endless night, a reminder that beauty and joy could still exist even in this place designed to eliminate both. "What's your name?" Sorcha asked. Ailbe Tierney, and I'm going to make sure you remember that, and that you remember your own name too, no matter what they try to do to us here. For the first time since arriving at Carrickley, Ailbe felt like she was capable of giving something to another person, instead of just surviving the daily assault on her spirit. She had become an older sister to this frightened girl, a protector in a place where protection was scarce. But their moment of connection was short-lived. 3 days later, during the morning count that began each institutional day, Sorcia's bed was empty, not just unoccupied, stripped bare, as if it had never been slept in at all. The mattress had been removed, the small wooden table cleared of her few possessions, even the regulation blanket had vanished. When Elba asked the matron on duty where Sorcia had gone, the woman's response was delivered with the same bureaucratic indifference they used for everything. That resident has been transferred to a more appropriate facility for her particular needs. But Ailbe knew better now. She had learned to read the institutional lies, to understand what transferred really meant in the vocabulary of Carrickley. Girls didn't get transferred. They got erased, the same way Kawimi had been erased, the same way dozens of others had simply vanished from the dining hall benches and dormitory rooms. That night, a new warning appeared on the bulletin board in Ward C, written in the same official handwriting that marked all institutional communications. Residents who persist in rebellious behavior and who attempt to influence other residents in negative ways will face immediate administrative action. Disobedient girls disappear like dust in the wind. The message was clearly meant for her, a direct threat delivered with the cold efficiency that characterized everything about this place. But instead of frightening her into submission, it only strengthened her resolve. They could take Sorcia, they could take Kawimi, they could take anyone who showed the slightest spark of independent thought, but they couldn't take her memories of them, and they couldn't stop her from carrying their spirits forward. As she lay in her narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling where condensation formed patterns like tears, she found something tucked under her pillow that made her heart race. It was a small piece of paper, folded tight and warm as if it had been clutched in someone's hand. When she opened it carefully, she found a message written in shaky handwriting. Tomorrow night, after second bell, door 3 behind the laundry, come alone. The message wasn't signed, but somehow Ailbe knew with absolute certainty that it was connected to Sorcia, to Kawimi, to all the girls who had supposedly been transferred, but whose voices she still heard in the wind that whistled through Carrickley's corridors. Someone was still fighting, someone was still resisting, and tomorrow night she would find out who. The day that followed the mysterious message crawled by with excruciating slowness. Each minute stretched like wire under tension. Ailbe moved through the familiar routine of institutional life. Morning prayers in the cold chapel, watery porridge at breakfast, hours of scrubbing floors until her knees were raw. But her mind was entirely focused on what the night might bring. Who had left the note? Was it someone trying to help her escape, or was it a trap designed to test her loyalty to the system that held her captive? During the afternoon moral instruction session, where Sister Margaret droned on about the evils of independent thought and the virtue of absolute submission, Ailbe found herself studying the other girls with new intensity. Was one of them her mysterious correspondent? The girl with the Dublin accent who sometimes caught her eye during prayers? The quiet redhead who worked in the kitchen and might have access to areas others couldn't reach? Or perhaps someone she'd never suspected? Someone who had learned to hide their resistance so well that even she couldn't detect it. The second bell rang at 10:30. Marking the official end of the day and the beginning of the enforced silence that lasted until morning. Prayers. Ailbe lay in her narrow bed, fully clothed beneath her regulation nightgown, listening to the sounds of the building settling into its uneasy quiet. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors as the night guards began their rounds. Keys jangled like wind chimes, and somewhere in the depths of the building the heating system groaned and whispered like a living thing in pain. When she was certain that the dormitory wing had fallen into its deepest sleep, Ailbe slipped from her bed and moved toward the door with the stealth she'd learned during her months of imprisonment. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows and created pools of darkness where a careful person could move unseen. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold linoleum as she made her way through the maze of institutional architecture toward the laundry facility. Door 3 was exactly where the note had indicated, tucked behind the large industrial washing machines that served the entire facility. It was a heavy steel door marked only with a number, no indication of what lay beyond it. When Ailbe tried the handle, she found it locked tight, but as she examined it more closely in the dim light, she noticed something that made her heart race with possibility. At the base of the door, where it met the floor, there was a gap, wider than normal, as if the door had settled unevenly in its frame over the years. The space was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it led to what appeared to be a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the laundry room. The opening was just wide enough for someone determined enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Elby dropped to her hands and knees and began the terrifying process of squeezing through the gap. The space was so tight that she had to exhale completely to make her ribcage small enough to fit. And for several panic-inducing moments she was genuinely stuck, unable to move forward or backward. The concrete scraped against her back and chest, tearing her nightgown and leaving bloody scratches on her skin. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she emerged into a narrow tunnel that smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleaning chemicals. The space was barely tall enough for her to crawl through, and she had to feel her way forward in complete darkness, her hands encountering spiderwebs, moisture, and things she preferred not to identify. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, branching off in directions that led deeper into the building's hidden infrastructure. But Elby followed what felt like the main path, driven by an instinct that this route would lead her toward freedom rather than deeper into captivity. Her knees and palms were soon bloody from crawling across the rough concrete, and the darkness was so complete that she began to question whether she was moving forward or in circles. After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the institutional underworld, she saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A faint rectangle of lighter darkness ahead, suggesting an opening to the outside world. As she drew closer, she could smell fresh air mixed with the familiar scent of the Irish countryside, earth and grass and the distant salt tang of the ocean. The tunnel ended at a rusty metal grate that opened onto a small depression behind the main building, hidden from view by overgrown bushes and the natural slope of the land. Ilba pushed against the grate with all her strength, and after several terrifying moments when she thought it might be permanently sealed, it swung open with a screech of protesting metal. She emerged into the cool night air like something being born, gasping and shaking with the intensity of what she'd just accomplished. Above her, stars wheeled in a sky she hadn't seen clearly in months, and the moon cast everything in silver light that seemed impossibly beautiful after the artificial illumination of institutional life. For the first time since the white van had carried her away from Kilgariff, she was outside the walls that had defined her world. But her moment of triumph was short-lived. As she pulled herself fully from the tunnel and began to stand, she heard something that turned her blood to ice water, the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. The sound was unmistakable and terrifyingly close. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." The voice was male, calm, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. This wasn't one of the guards she'd grown accustomed to. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had been waiting for her in the darkness outside the tunnel. Ailbit turned to find herself facing a man in an expensive suit, the kind of formal wear she associated with solicitors and government officials rather than security personnel. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and cold eyes that reflected the moonlight like chips of ice. In his hand was a pistol pointed directly at her chest, held with the steady grip of someone who knew how to use it. "Going somewhere, Miss Tierney?" he asked, and the fact that he knew her name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. I was just," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "You were attempting to escape from lawful custody," he said, as if reading from a legal document. "Did you really think we weren't monitoring your activities? Did you imagine that your little messages to disappeared residents went unnoticed?" The revelation hit her like a physical blow. They had been watching her all along, tracking her movements, reading her correspondence with other girls, probably even listening to her conversations through hidden microphones. The tunnel, the note, the apparent opportunity for escape. It had all been a setup, a test to see how far she would go in her resistance to their authority. "Here's what's going to happen," the man continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "You're going to walk back through that tunnel, return to your dormitory, and never speak of this incident to anyone. In exchange, I won't include this escape attempt in your official file, which would extend your stay here considerably beyond your 18th birthday." "I don't understand," Ailby said, though part of her was beginning to grasp the horrible implications of what he was telling her. "You signed a social contract when you arrived here," he explained with the patience of someone speaking to a particularly slow child. "Not just the legal documents your parents signed, but a deeper contract with the society that placed you here. You belong to this institution until you're 18, Miss Tierney. Your labor, your thoughts, your very existence, all of it belongs to us until we decide you're ready to rejoin the world. And if I refuse, she asked. Though she already knew the answer, the man smiled, an expression that never reached his eyes. Then your Aunt Ariane loses her visiting privileges permanently. She'll never see you again. Never know what became of you. Never have the opportunity to provide whatever small comfort her presence might offer. Is your moment of rebellion worth condemning her to that uncertainty? The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was emotional blackmail designed to exploit the one connection she still had to the outside world. They were using her love for her aunt as a weapon against her, turning her strongest remaining relationship into another form of captivity. Defeated by the impossibility of fighting an enemy that could weaponize love itself, Ailbe allowed herself to be escorted back through the tunnel to her dormitory. But as she crawled through the darkness for the second time that night, now as a prisoner returning to her cell rather than an escapee fleeing toward freedom, she discovered something that would sustain her through the dark months ahead. Hidden in the deepest part of the tunnel where her desperate hands had searched for purchase during her initial escape attempt, her fingers had encountered something that wasn't concrete or dirt or spider webs. It was paper, several pieces of it, tucked into a crevice where they'd remained dry and preserved despite the tunnel's dampness. When she returned to her cell and examined her discovery by the dim light that filtered through her barred window, she found that she was holding messages left by other girls who had attempted the same escape route. They were written on scraps torn from prayer books, on pieces of institutional letterhead, on anything that could hold writing. The messages were brief but powerful. Bridget O'Malley was here. July 1962, still fighting. Mary Kate Sullivan, remember us. They can break our bodies, but not our spirits. See, the last one was clearly from Kauimi. And seeing her friend's familiar handwriting was like receiving a message from beyond the grave. But more important than any individual message was what they represented collectively. Proof that the resistance at Carrickley was older and deeper than she'd imagined. That girls had been fighting the system for decades. As she carefully hid the messages in her usual spot beneath the loose floorboard, Ailbe added her own contribution to the collection. Ailbe Tierney, December 1963. The tunnel is watched, but we are not alone. Others have walked this path. Others will follow. Remember, they can contain our bodies, but they cannot imprison hope itself. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. 5 years, 1,826 days, 43,824 hours. Ailbe had stopped counting after the first year, but the numbers lived in her bones like a fever that never quite broke. She had arrived at Carrickley as a 13-year-old child with fire in her eyes and rebellion in her heart. Now, on the morning of her 18th birthday, she stood before the mirror in the communal washroom and saw a stranger looking back at her. The girl in the reflection had learned to move quietly through institutional corridors, to keep her eyes downcast during inspections, to recite prayers she didn't believe with a voice that betrayed nothing of the fury that still burned in her chest. Her red hair had grown back, though it would never again reach the wild curls of her childhood. The regular trimmings mandated by institutional policy had trained it into submission. Her face had lengthened and sharpened, the soft roundness of adolescence carved away by years of inadequate nutrition and constant stress. But her eyes still held something that 5 years of systematic brutality hadn't been able to extinguish. It was harder now, more carefully hidden, but it was there. The spark that Aunt Ariane had begged her to protect. The fire that made her who she was beneath all the institutional conditioning. At precisely 9 o'clock on that gray March morning, a guard appeared at her dormitory door. "Tierney," she announced with the same bureaucratic indifference that had marked every interaction for 5 years. "Report to the director's office. Bring your personal effects." Personal effects. The phrase was almost laughable. After 5 years at Carrickley, her worldly possessions consisted of a worn prayer book, a few letters from Aunt Ariane that had somehow survived the periodic room searches, and the small metal fragment she'd used to carve messages into concrete walls. Everything else that had defined her childhood had been systematically stripped away, donated to charity, or thrown away as part of the character reformation process. The director's office was a room Ailbe had only seen twice during her imprisonment, once when she'd arrived as a terrified child, and once when she'd been caught attempting to help a younger girl who was being systematically starved as punishment for asking questions during doctrine class. Director Walsh was a thin woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. She had the bearing of someone who had spent decades breaking the spirits of children, and had learned to sleep peacefully despite the nightmares she created. "Today is your 18th birthday," Director Walsh said without preamble, consulting a thick file that contained 5 years of Ailbe's institutional history. "According to the terms of your placement here, you are now legally free to leave Carrickley and rejoin society." She looked up from the file and studied Ailbe with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating livestock. "I hope you understand that the world outside these walls is more cruel and unforgiving than anything you've experienced here. We've provided you with structure, discipline, and moral guidance. Without that framework, many girls like you find themselves lost, falling into patterns of behavior that lead them back to institutions far less charitable than ours." Ailbe stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in the regulation posture they'd drilled into her over thousands of morning inspections. But inside, something was roaring with joy so fierce it threatened to burst from her chest. Freedom. The word tasted like honey and lightning, like the first breath after nearly drowning. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her soul. Director Walsh continued to study her, as if searching for cracks in her composure. "You've been challenging to work with, Miss Tierney. Your record shows numerous incidents of defiance, failure to fully embrace our moral instruction, and what our staff has characterized as spiritual resistance to the reformation process. I've learned to control my behavior," Ailbe replied, which was true in its way. She had learned to hide her rebellion so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there, like a coal buried in ash that could still spark into flame under the right conditions. "See that you continue to do so," the director said, closing the file with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. "You'll find that the outside world has little patience for young women who haven't learned their proper place in society." As Ailbe turned to leave, Director Walsh's voice stopped her at the door. "One final piece of advice, Miss Tierney. Forget what happened here. Forget the other girls. Forget the difficulties of your stay. Move forward with your life and be grateful for the character formation you've received. Those who dwell on the past, who spread tales about their experiences here, often find that the past has ways of catching up with them." The threat was delivered with the same calm professionalism that characterized everything about Carrickley, but its meaning was unmistakable. Silence was the price of her freedom, the unspoken contract that would allow her to walk through those gates and never return. Ailbe nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, but as she walked through the corridors of Carrickley for the last time, she made a different kind of vow. She would never forget. She would never stop carrying the spirits of Kaumi and Sorsha, and all the other girls who had been broken by this place. And someday, when she was strong enough and far enough away, she would find a way to make sure their stories were told. The main gates of Carrickley stood open for her, the first time she'd seen them that way since the day she'd arrived. Beyond them, a familiar figure waited by a small blue car that seemed impossibly bright and cheerful. After years of institutional gray and brown, Aunt Ariane had aged visibly during the 5 years of monthly visits through reinforced glass. Her hair was completely gray now, and new lines mapped the geography of worry around her eyes. But when she saw Ailbe walking through those gates, her face lit up with a joy so pure, it made the spring morning seem brighter. They embraced in the car park of Carrickley Institute, holding each other with the desperate intensity of two people who had been drowning and had finally found solid ground. Ailbe breathed in the familiar scent of her aunt's perfume, lavender, and something that smelled like home, and felt something inside her chest that had been held tight for 5 years finally begin to relax. "Let's go home, love," Ariane whispered. And those 4 words were the most beautiful sentence Ailbe had ever heard. The drive away from Carrickley took them through countryside that seemed almost hallucinogenic in its beauty. After years of viewing the world through barred windows, green fields rolled away toward distant mountains, sheep grazed in meadows dotted with wildflowers, and the sky stretched overhead in shades of blue that Ailbe had nearly forgotten existed. Every mile that passed between her and the institution felt like another chain falling away. But even as her body began to relax into the passenger seat of her aunt's car, even as the familiar landscape of County Cork began to heal something deep in her spirit, Ailbe carried with her the invisible weight of 5 years that could never be returned to her. She was 18 years old, but she felt ancient, scarred by experiences that had aged her soul beyond her physical years. At Aunt Ariane's cottage, a small stone house surrounded by the garden that Ailbe remembered from childhood visits, she discovered that freedom was more complicated than she'd imagined. The simple act of choosing what to eat for breakfast, of deciding when to sleep and wake, of moving through space without permission or supervision was overwhelming after years of institutional routine. She woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm, her body still programmed to the rhythm of Caracley bells. She ate in silence, unable to break the habit of institutional dining where conversation was forbidden. She started at sudden sounds, flinched when doors closed too loudly, and found herself unable to sleep without checking that her bedroom door could be opened from the inside. But slowly, gradually, under Aunt Ariane's patient care, she began to remember who she had been before Caracley tried to erase her. She learned to laugh again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She discovered books that had nothing to do with moral instruction, music that wasn't hymns, conversations that ranged freely across topics that had been forbidden for 5 years. She found work at a small cafe in the nearby town of Bantry, serving tea and sandwiches to tourists and locals. The work was simple, honest, and allowed her to practice the art of normal human interaction in small, manageable doses. Her employer, Mrs. Murphy, was a kind woman who asked no questions about Ailbe's past and seemed to understand that some silences were meant to be respected. Months passed, then years. Ailbe enrolled in evening classes, earned her leaving certificate, and eventually qualified as a care assistant. She discovered that her experiences at Caracley, traumatic as they had been, had given her an unusual capacity for recognizing pain in others and providing comfort to those who had been forgotten by society. At 27, she married Ivan Kowalski, a Polish carpenter who had settled in Cork after his own difficult journey from a homeland that had rejected him. They understood each other's silences, the way trauma could make even love feel dangerous, the courage required to build a new life from the ashes of dreams that had been systematically destroyed. They had 2 children, Luca and Neve, and Ailbe discovered that parenthood was both a joy and a terror. Every night as she tucked them into their beds in rooms with doors that locked from the inside, she made them the same promise. No one will ever take you away from me. No one will ever make you feel ashamed of who you are. But despite the life she had built, despite the love she had found and the family she had created, the past remained a weight she carried like stones in her pockets. The nightmares never completely stopped. The fear never entirely faded. And the questions? About the girls who had disappeared, about the staff who had participated in their systematic abuse, about the parents who had been willing to pay for their children's spirits to be broken. Those questions burned in her like a fever that no amount of happiness could cure. It was on Luca's 5th birthday, as she watched him blow out candles on a cake she had baked with her own hands in her own kitchen, that Ailbe made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would return to Kilgareth. She would face the people who had abandoned her, not for forgiveness. She had moved beyond the need for their approval, but for closure, for the right to look them in the eyes and show them who she had become despite their attempts to destroy her. That night, after Ivan had put the children to bed, she sat at her kitchen table and composed a letter she had been writing in her mind for nearly a decade. But this one would be different from all the desperate pleas she had sent from Caracley. This one would be written by a woman who had survived, who had thrived, who had claimed her life back from those who had tried to steal it. She would go home, not as the broken child they had tried to create, but as the woman she had become in spite of them. Ailbe parked her small blue car at the entrance to what had once been Seaview Cottage, though the sea view had long since been obscured by overgrown hedgerows, and the cottage itself seemed to have shrunk in on itself, like something ashamed. The stone walls were darkened with dampness and neglect, and what had once been her mother's prize-winning garden had become a tangle of weeds and brambles that seemed to be slowly reclaiming the house for the wild Atlantic landscape. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she sat there, gathering the courage that had brought her this far. Beside her in the passenger seat lay a manila envelope containing photocopies of every letter she had sent from Caracley, every desperate plea that had been returned unread, every attempt at communication that had been rejected without consideration. She had kept them all these years, not out of masochism, but as evidence of what had been lost between them. In the back seat Even sat quietly with Luca and Nayav, aged 7 and 5 respectively. Her children were the reason she could do this. They were proof that she had not only survived but flourished, evidence that love could grow even in soil that had been poisoned by abandonment and institutional cruelty. "Do you want me to come with you?" Ivan asked in his careful English, still touched by the accent of his homeland. He understood better than most what it meant to confront a past that would rather remain buried. "No," Ailbe said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to see them as I am now, not as someone who needs protection, but stay close enough to hear if I call out." She walked up the cobblestone path that she had last traveled as a 13-year-old child being dragged to a white van. The stones were cracked now, weeds growing between them, and the gate hung crooked on hinges that needed oiling. Everything about the place spoke of people who had given up on maintenance, on hope, on the basic care that keeps a home from becoming merely a house. When she knocked on the wooden door, the same door she had clung to 15 years ago while pleading not to be taken away, the sound seemed to echo not just through the cottage but through time itself. Footsteps approached slowly, hesitantly, as if whoever was inside was as afraid of this confrontation as she was. The door opened to reveal a man she almost didn't recognize. Ian Tierney had aged more than the 15 years that had passed since she'd last seen him. His hair, once thick and dark, was now completely gray and sparse, combed over a scalp that showed through like pale earth beneath dying grass. His face was gaunt, marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and guilt that had worn channels in his features like water cutting through limestone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He stared at her with eyes that seemed to be seeing a ghost, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to speak, but had forgotten how words worked. She studied his face, looking for some trace of the father who had once taught her to skip stones on the beach, who had carried her on his shoulders during village festivals, who had tucked her into bed with stories of selkies and fairy forts. "Ilba?" he whispered finally, the name sounding strange in his mouth as if he hadn't spoken it in years. "Hello, Da," she said, and was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "I've come home." Before he could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway behind him. Siobhan Tierney had shrunk into herself over the years, becoming a small, bird-like woman who seemed to inhabit her clothes rather than wear them. Her hair, once carefully styled and pinned, hung limp around a face that had lost all its color and most of its flesh. She looked like someone who had been slowly disappearing and was now only partially present in the world. When Siobhan saw Ilbe, her reaction was immediate and devastating. She fell to her knees on the cottage floor, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face with an intensity that suggested years of suppressed grief finally finding release. "Oh God," she sobbed. "Oh my God, what did we do? What did we do to you?" For 15 years, Ailbe had imagined this moment. She had rehearsed conversations, planned speeches, prepared herself for anger, defiance, justification, or even continued rejection. But she had not prepared herself for this, for the sight of two people who appeared to have been destroyed by their own choices, who had paid a price for their decision that she could see, written in every line of their faces. "We thought," Ian began, then stopped, his voice breaking on the words. "We were told it was for your own good. The priest said, the social worker said, they all said you were troubled, that you needed help we couldn't give you." "I was 13 years old," Ailbe said quietly. "I asked questions in religion class. I argued with Ma about wearing dresses to mass every day. I read books that weren't approved by the church. Those were my crimes." Siobhan was still on her knees, still sobbing, her words barely intelligible. "We wanted you to be good, to be acceptable, to have a proper life. We didn't know. They didn't tell us what it would be like for you there." "Did you ever try to find out?" Ailbe asked. "In 5 years, did you ever write a letter asking how I was? Did you ever visit? Did you ever wonder if I was still alive?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They had chosen not to know, not to think about what they had done, not to consider the daily reality of their daughter's life in institutional care. It had been easier to trust the authorities, to believe they had made the right choice, to avoid confronting the consequences of their decision. Ailbe reached into her coat and withdrew the manila envelope. She opened it and spread the photocopied letters across the small table in their front room. Dozens of them, each bearing the cruel stamp, "Recipient refuses delivery." "These are the letters I sent you," she said. "Every one of them returned unread. I wrote to you for 3 years before I finally understood that you didn't want to hear from me at all." Ian picked up one of the letters with shaking hands, his eyes scanning words his daughter had written in desperation 15 years ago. As he read, his face crumpled like paper in fire. "We were told, they said it would be better for your rehabilitation if we didn't have contact, that it would only make things harder for you. And you believed them," Ailbe said. "It wasn't a question. We were afraid," Siobhan whispered from the floor. "We were afraid of what people would say if we brought you home unchanged. We were afraid of the priest, of the neighbors, of doing the wrong thing. We thought if we let them fix you, you'd come back and we could be a family again." "Fix me?" Ailby repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the words. There was nothing wrong with me that love couldn't have solved, nothing broken that patience couldn't have mended. But instead of trying to understand me, you paid strangers to break my spirit. She walked to the window that looked out over what had once been her mother's garden, now wild and overgrown. In the distance, she could see Ivan and the children playing by the car, their laughter carrying on the wind like music from another world, the world she had built for herself, despite everything that had been done to her. I want you to know something, she said, turning back to face her parents. I survived. Not just the institution, but the knowledge that the people who should have loved me unconditionally chose to abandon me instead. I survived, and I built a life. I have a husband who loves me exactly as I am. I have children who will never ever doubt that they are wanted and cherished. She picked up the letters and returned them to the envelope. I didn't come here for an apology. I didn't come here for forgiveness or reconciliation. I came here to show you who I became despite your efforts to change me. I came here to close a door that should have been closed 15 years ago. Before leaving, she placed a new envelope on the table, one that contained a single sheet of paper with words she had written the night before. To Ian and Siobhan Tierney, you erased my childhood, but you could not erase my soul. You tried to break my spirit, but you only made it stronger. You taught me that love can be conditional and cruel, but I chose to learn a different lesson. I learned that the family you choose can heal the wounds left by the family you were born into. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred would poison the life I've built. But I will never forget, and I will never pretend that what you did was anything other than what it was. The betrayal of a child by the people who should have protected her above all others. Live with that knowledge, as I have learned to live with mine. As she walked back to her car, where her real family waited, Ailubi felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Complete peace. The wound that had been bleeding in her heart since childhood had finally closed. Not through reconciliation or forgiveness, but through the simple act of showing herself and them that she had not only survived, but transcended what they had tried to do to her. Ivan rolled down the window as she approached. How do you feel? He asked. Ailby looked back at the cottage where two broken people were learning to live with the full weight of their choices, then at her children, who were looking at her with the kind of unconditional love she had once believed was impossible. Free, she said. For the first time in my life, I'm completely free. As they drove away from Kilgariff, the afternoon sun breaking through clouds to cast golden light across the Irish countryside, Ailby whispered something into the wind that carried her words out over the Atlantic, toward whatever destiny awaited her and the family she had chosen. Now I am truly free. How many times does silence weigh more than a scream? How many wounds remain hidden because those who should have loved chose to stay quiet? Ailby survived what many couldn't bear, but the question that remains is, if it were you in her place, could you forgive, even without receiving an apology? Could you move forward, even without getting justice? This story isn't just about abandonment. It's about resistance, about rebuilding a life when everything around you tried to erase you. It's about turning pain into strength, and especially about the courage to return, not to reopen wounds, but to show that they've healed, and that who you've become, no one can ever take away.